Alex Sterling reclined in the plush leather armchair of his private club, a half-empty tumbler of amber liquid nestled in his manicured hand. Around him, the low hum of conversation from men just as immaculately tailored and excessively wealthy as himself was a comforting, familiar drone. They were his peers, his confidants, and often his unwitting pawns in the grand, intricate game he called life. Tonight, however, the game was unusually high stakes, even for him. Damien, ever the instigator, leaned forward, a predatory glint in his eyes. "So, Alex, the bet stands. A full year married to someone unconventional." He air-quoted the word with a sneer that perfectly encapsulated their shared disdain for anything outside their gilded cage. Ethan, less vocal but equally cynical, merely nodded, his gaze flicking between Alex and Damien, eager for the spectacle. Alex merely smiled, a slow, predatory curve of his lips that rarely reached his eyes. "Unconventional," he repeated, savoring the word, a term so delightfully vague, yet so universally understood within our circle. A woman who would make society pages gasp not with envy, but with sheer incredulity. The sum involved was astronomical, even for him, but it wasn't solely about the money. It was about principle. It was about proving a point that he had long held dear. Love was a myth, a transactional illusion peddled to the gullible masses. Relationships were business deals, negotiations of convenience, and he intended to demonstrate that with devastating clarity. He would enter this sham of a marriage, play the devoted husband for precisely 365 days, and emerge victorious, his pockets heavier and his convictions reinforced. Emotional involvement? The very thought was laughable. A carefully constructed facade, a theatrical performance, was all that was required. His search had been brief, clinical, devoid of anything resembling genuine interest. He needed someone who would instantly scream mismatch to anyone observing, yet possess a quiet dignity that wouldn't devolve into public spectacle. He'd found her, almost effortlessly, at a charity gala he'd been dragged to by his PR team, a truly absurd gathering dedicated to some obscure artistic endeavor he couldn't recall. Her name was Clara. She wasn't aggressive or flamboyant, nor did she possess any of the overt oddities his friends might have expected. No, her unconventional nature, in the brutal calculus of their world, was far more mundane, yet undeniably potent. She was undeniably large, her frame ample, soft curves spilling over a dress that, while tasteful, did little to conceal her size. She moved with an almost ethereal grace, her presence gentle, her gaze intelligent but unassuming. She wasn't trying to hide, nor was she trying to draw attention. She simply was. Perfect, an easy target for his experiment, a woman he was confident he could marry without the slightest tremor of emotional consequence. Clara, in her quiet corner, reading a discarded program while others networked furiously, was everything his world was not. She was real, unvarnished, and utterly lacking in the calculating pretense that defined his circle. He watched her from across the room, a detached observer planning his next corporate takeover. She represented the antithesis of everything he valued, the lean, the sharp, the ruthlessly efficient. She was soft, yielding, and completely outside his aesthetic. The irony, he noted, with a flicker of amusement, was that her very normality, her utter lack of artifice, made her the most unconventional choice of all. His friends had expected a wild artist, an eccentric activist, perhaps even a notorious socialite with a questionable past. Instead, he would present them with Clara and watch their smug expressions curdle into confusion. The thought of her, his soon-to-be unsuspecting bride, stirred no emotion in him beyond a cold sense of satisfaction. She was a means to an end, a living prop in his grand play. He envisioned the headlines, the whispered gossip, the sheer audacity of it all. It would be magnificent. The year would pass, a blur of polite indifference and public displays of fabricated affection, and then he would be free, wealthier, and with another undeniable victory etched into the annals of his charmed life. He saw himself walking away clean, his heart entirely untouched, proving once and for all that love was simply a leverage point for others to exploit. He would be the puppet master, pulling the strings, directing the narrative, and Clara would simply be a part of the scenery. He was Alex Sterling, and he always won. The game was set. He just needed her to say "I do." The ink on the prenuptial agreement, a document so clinically precise it read more like a corporate merger than a promise of matrimony, was barely dry before Alex's formidable PR machine roared into action. In a mere matter of weeks, a private wedding, shrouded in a veil of carefully constructed discretion, materialized from the ether of high-end event planning. Every detail, from the minimalist floral arrangements to the meticulously vetted guest list, comprising only a handful of Alex's closest business associates and even a smaller number of Clara's seemingly non-existent immediate family, was orchestrated with a calculated precision that spoke volumes of Alex's influence and his team's ruthless efficiency. There was no grand spectacle, no media circus Alex had initially envisioned for maximum impact. That would come later, once the initial shock of his choice had settled. This was merely the quiet, almost sterile beginning. Alex, observing the flurry of activity around him from the insulated calm of his penthouse, felt a flicker of detached amusement. It was all so perfectly executed, a testament to his ability to bend reality to his will. The speed was crucial, designed to prevent any premature leaks or the meddling of his friends who might have tried to sabotage his carefully laid plans, or worse, offer unwanted advice. He merely signed the papers, approved the budget, and occasionally nodded at a fabric swatch or a menu suggestion, his mind already calculating the next moves in his elaborate game. He never once considered Clara's input. Her preferences were irrelevant to the equation. Clara, on the other hand, navigated the sudden, bewildering tide of arrangements with a quiet, almost unsettling composure that Alex found mildly perplexing. He had half expected tears, questions, perhaps even a panicked withdrawal, but she offered none of it. Her acceptance of his unconventional proposal had been delivered with an unnerving calm, her gaze steady, almost unreadable. When his PR team presented her with a selection of haute couture gowns for the ceremony, she chose a simple, elegant ivory dress with a quiet grace, devoid of the theatrical delight or girlish excitement one might expect. She attended the fittings, answered their questions about her preferences with brief, polite responses, and generally behaved like a perfectly cooperative, if somewhat ethereal, participant. Alex, in the fleeting moments their paths crossed during these preparatory stages, found himself searching for an underlying motive in her eyes, a hint of desperation, a glimmer of ambition, anything that would fit his cynical framework of human nature. But there was nothing, just a serene, almost contemplative stillness that baffled him. Her reasons for agreeing to this charade remained an opaque mystery, a small, irritating wrinkle in his otherwise flawless scheme. He dismissed it as an elaborate act, a cleverly constructed facade designed to lull him into a false sense of security before she eventually revealed her true grasping intentions. He was Alex Sterling, after all. He had seen it all before. The wedding day itself was an exercise in polite formality, a meticulously choreographed tableau devoid of genuine warmth. Held in the exquisitely manicured gardens of a discreet estate nestled in the Hamptons, the ceremony was brief, efficient, and entirely impersonal. Alex, immaculately dressed in a bespoke tuxedo, stood beside Clara at the altar, his posture rigid, his expression a carefully neutral mask. He offered her a faint, almost imperceptible smile when the officiant prompted, a calculated gesture for the benefit of the few cameras present, poised to capture images for a carefully curated press release. His eyes, however, held no warmth, no tenderness. They were cool, analytical, observing the proceedings as if he were an investor at a quarterly earnings call. He watched as Clara, her simple dress a stark contrast to the opulence surrounding them, walked down the short aisle, her stride even, her head held high. Her dark hair was styled simply, pulled back to reveal the delicate curve of her jaw, and her hands, clasped loosely in front of her, betrayed no tremor. When she stood beside him, she didn't offer a nervous glance or a shy smile. She simply met his eyes for a fleeting second, her own a deep, unfathomable brown, before turning her attention back to the officiant. There was no nervous laughter, no whispered endearments, no fumbling of rings. The vows, standard and impersonal, were recited in clear, measured tones by both of them, Alex's voice carrying the clipped authority of a CEO, Clara's a soft, even murmur that held a peculiar resonance. When he slipped the ring onto her finger, a modest but undeniably expensive diamond band chosen by his assistant, her touch was light, almost imperceptible, betraying neither excitement nor reluctance. The reception that followed was equally subdued, a high-society networking event thinly disguised as a celebration. Alex moved through the small crowd, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries, his performance as the doting groom convincing only to those who didn't know him well. He occasionally sought out Clara, presenting her to a financier or a gallery owner, introducing her simply as "my wife, Clara." Each time he placed a proprietary hand on the small of her back, a gesture of ownership rather than affection. His touch was brief and purely for show. Clara, for her part, received these introductions with an unwavering politeness, her responses articulate and concise.
She engaged in polite conversation when addressed, but never initiated, never sought attention. She moved through the room with a quiet dignity that was both understated and undeniably present, a calm eddy in the current of superficial chatter. She drank sparkling water, nibbled sparingly at the artisanal canapés, and listened more than she spoke. Alex found himself, on more than one occasion, observing her from across the room. She wasn't playing the part of the overwhelmed ingenue, nor was she attempting to insert herself into the powerful cliques. Instead, she seemed to be watching. Her eyes, often fixed on him or on the dynamics of the room, held an unsettling stillness, an absence of judgment that was almost more disconcerting than open contempt. She was a silent observer, a witness to his performance, and Alex, despite his ironclad confidence, felt a faint, almost imperceptible prickle of unease. It was as if she saw through the carefully constructed artifice, not with accusation, but with a detached clarity that he found both unnerving and, to his irritation, slightly intriguing. The game was indeed set, the first move made. But Alex, for the first time, felt a fleeting sensation that he might not be the only one playing. He was certain he held all the cards, yet Clara remained an enigma, a wild card he hadn't fully accounted for. The year had just begun. The year had just begun, and with it, a new, unsettling routine settled into Alex Volkov's meticulously curated life. The vast, echoing halls of his private estate, a testament to unchecked ambition and generational wealth, now housed an unwelcome yet undeniably present anomaly, Clara. He had envisioned her as a pliable, perhaps slightly overwhelmed addition to his grand performance, someone who would gratefully occupy the space he afforded her. What he got, however, was a quiet force of nature, operating on a completely different frequency. Life in the mansion was less of a merger and more of a delicate, unspoken occupation. Alex had expected Clara to either recoil at the opulence or greedily embrace it, demanding changes, asserting her newfound status. Instead, she moved through the gilded cages of his home with a startling ease, as if the priceless tapestries and marble statues were merely furniture in any ordinary house. Her requests were few, almost embarrassingly simple: a quiet corner for reading, a schedule for the gardener to plant native wildflowers rather than exotic, high-maintenance blooms, and a preference for fresh vegetables over the elaborate gourmet meals Alex's private chef, Jean-Pierre, was accustomed to preparing. It was her interactions with the staff that truly began to grate on Alex. He observed from a distance, or sometimes caught snippets during his infrequent descents from his private study. Mrs. Gable, the stoic, iron-willed housekeeper who had served the Volkoff family for 30 years, often wore a faint, almost imperceptible smile after a conversation with Clara. Marcus, the surly head of security, who communicated primarily in grunts and clipped sentences, was seen discussing the health of his daughter with Clara in the expansive conservatory. Even Jean-Pierre, a man whose culinary genius was matched only by his formidable temper, found himself inexplicably offering Clara cooking lessons in the sprawling industrial-grade kitchen, teaching her the delicate art of a bechamel sauce when she merely asked for advice on making a simple, wholesome soup. Clara disarmed them all, not with attempts at friendship, but with genuine consideration and a profound, uncomplicated kindness. She remembered birthdays, asked after ailing parents, and complimented their work with a sincerity that resonated. She listened, truly listened, without judgment or expectation, a stark contrast to the transactional relationships that defined Alex's world. The staff, initially wary of the bet wife as they discreetly whispered amongst themselves, now seemed to orbit her with an unexpected warmth, a loyalty that Alex, despite his power and wealth, had never commanded. It was as if she had bypassed his authority entirely, connecting directly to the human core of his employees. This growing affection towards her, this ease she fostered, was an unwelcome disruption to his meticulously ordered domestic kingdom. Alex found himself increasingly irritated by her unwavering politeness, her inability to be ruffled. He'd test her, subtly at first. He'd leave a demanding message with Mrs. Gable to be relayed to Clara, expecting a meek compliance or a frustrated sigh. Instead, the reply would come back, delivered by Mrs. Gable with an almost defiant lightness. Mrs. Volkoff said she'd be delighted to assist. He'd suggest an elaborate social event, anticipating her apprehension or a flurry of questions about protocol. Clara would simply nod, her eyes calm, and say, "That sounds fine, Alex." No fuss, no drama, no attempt to assert her preferences. It was maddening. His preconceived notions about her, honed by years of cynical observation, were contradicted at every turn. He had expected an overt display of gratitude, perhaps an attempt to navigate the treacherous waters of high society with clumsy enthusiasm or calculating ambition. Instead, Clara moved through the nascent social obligations of her new life with an understated grace, an innate elegance that had nothing to do with her attire or background, but everything to do with her inherent composure. At a charity gala, an event Alex had reluctantly attended with her, expecting her to be overshadowed, she held her own.
She didn't seek attention, but when approached, she engaged with genuine interest, discussing books with a renowned author, or advocating for a local animal shelter with a quiet passion that drew others in. She wasn't playing a part, she was simply being herself, utterly oblivious or perhaps indifferent to the complex social gymnastics around her. Alex watched, a faint muscle ticking in his jaw as his friends, initially sneering, found themselves listening, occasionally even smiling at something she said. The most unnerving aspect, however, was her gaze,
Those quiet, observant eyes continued to follow him, to linger on the subtle shifts in his expression, the unconscious gestures he made. It wasn't accusatory, never critical, but rather an almost scientific observation. It felt as if she were dissecting him, not to find flaws, but to understand the intricate machinery of his being. He would sometimes catch her looking at him across a vast dining table or from a window as he left for the office, and that unsettling stillness, that absence of judgment, would prickle his skin. It was more effective than any open contempt or challenge. It implied an understanding he hadn't granted her, a perception that cut through his carefully constructed artifice and observed the vulnerable, exposed self beneath. He tried to provoke a reaction, a flicker of emotion. One evening, he made a deliberately cutting remark about the simplicity of her tastes, expecting a blush, perhaps a quiet withdrawal. Instead, she merely tilted her head slightly, a small, genuine smile playing on her lips. "I find beauty in simplicity, Alex," she had said, her voice soft but firm, "and comfort in authenticity." Her answer was not a defense, but a statement of self, utterly devoid of any need for his approval. It was then, standing in the grand library, surrounded by volumes he rarely opened, that Alex felt a chill, an unfamiliar sensation. He had set the game, designed the rules, but Clara, with her quiet dignity and unwavering genuineness, was playing an entirely different one he hadn't anticipated, and, to his growing irritation, couldn't seem to control. His certainty, once ironclad, was beginning to fray at the edges. The year had just begun, and Clara, the wild card, was already subtly yet profoundly rewriting the script. The script continued to be rewritten, not by grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but by the quiet, steady rhythm of Clara's presence. Alex, despite his carefully constructed indifference, found himself increasingly attuned to her movements, her soft voice, the way she effortlessly navigated the labyrinthine dynamics of his household. He watched, always from a slight remove, as she introduced small personal touches to the mansion. A vase of wildflowers on a seldom-used table, a forgotten cushion plumped and returned to its rightful place, each detail a gentle brushstroke on the canvas of his sterile existence. He told himself it was merely an observation, an analytical interest in how his project was developing, yet an undercurrent of something else, something less clinical, tugged at him. The fragile peace of the mansion was shattered one Tuesday evening, not by a social scandal or a business crisis, but by a whimper, thin and distressed, echoing from the vast drawing room. It belonged to Bartholomew, affectionately known as Barty, a grizzled old Labrador Alex had inherited from his late grandfather. Barty was more of a fixture than a pet, a comfortable, largely ignored presence that had ambled through Alex's life for years. Now the old dog lay slumped by the fireplace, his usually bright eyes dull and glazed, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. A wave of concern rippled through the staff, quickly turning to quiet panic. Alex, descending the grand staircase, paused, a flicker of annoyance at the disruption warring with a vague sense of unease. He expected his head of staff, Mrs. Albright, to handle it, to call the vet, to make arrangements. But as he reached the bottom step, he saw Clara. She wasn't issuing orders or delegating tasks. Instead, she was kneeling beside Barty, her hand gently stroking his matted fur, her face etched with a profound, almost visceral concern. Her voice, usually soft, was now a low, soothing murmur, a quiet comfort directed entirely at the distressed animal. "It's all right, old boy," she whispered, her fingers tracing the ridge of his spine. "We'll get you help. Just hold on." There was no dramatics, no performance for an audience. This was raw, unfiltered empathy. She looked up briefly, catching Mrs. Albright's worried gaze. "Call Dr. Evans immediately," she instructed, her voice calm but authoritative. "Tell him it's urgent. See if he can come here, or we'll need to take him to him." Then her attention returned entirely to Barty, her gaze unwavering, her touch reassuring. Alex watched, transfixed. His own experience with illness had always involved a flurry of experts, expensive treatments, and a carefully maintained emotional distance. He had rarely seen such direct, uninhibited compassion.
He had even less frequently seen it from someone who, by his own cynical estimation, should have been focused on leveraging her new position, on acquiring trinkets and status. Clara, however, was oblivious to anything but the suffering creature before her. She stayed by Barty's side while Mrs. Albright frantically made calls, fetching blankets and water, trying to make the old dog as comfortable as possible.
Even though Dr. Evans confirmed he could make a house call, Clara didn't relax. Instead, she remained on the floor, holding Barty's head in her lap, speaking to him in gentle tones, a living anchor of warmth in the suddenly tense room. Dr. Evans arrived quickly, a no-nonsense man who had treated generations of Alex's family pets. He examined Barty, his brow furrowed, and delivered the grave news. The old dog was in advanced heart failure, and his time was short. There was medication that could make him more comfortable, but no cure. The room grew silent, heavy with unspoken grief. Mrs. Albright dabbed at her eyes, the other staff members looking downcast. Alex felt a pang, unexpected and unfamiliar. Barty had been a part of the background of his life, a constant reminder of a simpler past, and the thought of his absence created a strange emptiness. He found himself looking at Clara, wondering how she would react to this irreversible truth. She didn't cry, not outwardly, though her eyes were glistening. She listened intently to Dr. Evans, asking precise, intelligent questions about Barty's comfort, about what else could be done to ease his suffering. She digested the information, nodded gravely, and then, without a moment's hesitation, moved closer to Barty, once again stroking his head. "Then we'll make sure his last days are filled with peace and love," she said, her voice a little choked but resolute. She spent the rest of the evening nursing Barty, moving him to a softer bed in a sunnier spot, ensuring he had access to water and his medication. She even hand-fed him small morsels when he refused to eat on his own, her patience boundless, her touch infinitely gentle. Alex, unable to tear himself away, found a quiet corner in the drawing room, pretending to read a business report on his tablet, but his gaze kept returning to Clara. He observed her through the long hours, her unwavering dedication, her quiet strength. He saw how she calmed the worried staff, how she consulted with Dr. Evans on follow-up care, how she simply was there, entirely present and utterly selfless. It was a stark, brutal contrast to the self-serving, performative compassion he was accustomed to in his circles. His friends would have sent the dog to a specialized clinic, paid for the most expensive treatments, and then perhaps made a donation in its name, all for the sake of appearances. Clara, however, simply gave herself, without expectation of reward or recognition. As the night deepened and most of the staff had retired, Clara remained by Barty's side. Alex, inexplicably drawn, found himself still in the drawing room, the digital document on his screen long forgotten. He watched her, a woman he had married for a bet, a woman he had dismissed as unconventional, demonstrating a depth of character that shamed his own superficial existence. Her warmth wasn't a facade, it was an innate, radiating force. He felt a peculiar tightening in his chest, a sensation he couldn't quite identify. It wasn't pity, nor was it simple admiration. It was something more profound, something that bypassed his intellect and struck directly at a long-dormant part of him. He had sought to prove a point about love being transactional, a commodity, but Clara, with her boundless, quiet empathy, was proving him utterly, completely wrong, one gentle, unwavering act at a time. The game he had so carefully constructed was now not merely fraying, it was being meticulously, undeniably dismantled, brick by a woman who hadn't even realized she was playing. He felt exposed, strangely vulnerable, and, to his utter confusion, momentarily, irreversibly captivated. Alex retreated from the immediate vicinity of the ailing pet, the echo of Clara's gentle ministrations still ringing in his ears, an unfamiliar warmth spreading through his own chest. The incident had ended well, the vet assured, thanks largely to Clara's quick thinking and profound, unwavering calm. He found himself avoiding her gaze, not out of disdain, but a disquieting sense of self-consciousness. The woman he had intended to manipulate had, instead, effortlessly exposed a cavernous emptiness within him he didn't know existed. Later that evening,
The vast dining room felt even larger than usual, the silence between them amplified by the clinking of cutlery on fine china. Alex, usually adept at maintaining a facade of detached sophistication, felt an uncharacteristic awkwardness. He picked at his elaborate meal, his thoughts a tangled mess of disbelief and a nascent, unsettling curiosity. Clara, however, seemed perfectly at ease, her presence a serene counterpoint to his internal turmoil. She spoke first, her voice soft, discussing a book she had started earlier that day, a historical novel that transported her far from the gilded cage of their temporary home. Alex, finding refuge in the mundane, responded in kind, though his answers felt wooden, forced. The conversation meandered, touching upon art, then travel, before an offhand remark from Alex about a childhood trip to the coast led them down an unexpected path. "Did you travel much as a child, Alex?" Clara asked, her eyes meeting his across the polished table, not with judgment, but with an open, genuine inquiry that pierced through his usual defenses. He hesitated. His childhood had been a blur of boarding schools, nannies, and parents perpetually absent, pursuing their own interests and fortunes. Memories were cold, factual recollections, devoid of the warmth or sentimentality Clara's questions seemed to imply. "Not really," he admitted, the words feeling foreign and small in his own mouth.
My parents were always busy. Business trips, charity galas. I mostly stayed at school or with various caregivers. He tried to inject a note of nonchalance into his tone, but even to his own ears, it sounded hollow. A brief, almost imperceptible tremor passed through him as a fleeting image of himself as a lonely boy clutching a faded teddy bear in an enormous empty room surfaced. He quickly suppressed it, his jaw tightening, his usual guardedness snapping back into place. Clara simply nodded, her gaze remaining steady, understanding, not pity. She didn't press, didn't offer facile commiseration, or worse, try to fill the silence with platitudes. Instead, she said, very quietly, "It must have been difficult, growing up so independently." Her words weren't accusatory, they were merely an observation, an acknowledgement of a past that he had meticulously buried beneath layers of ambition and cynicism. There was no judgment in her tone, only a profound, almost aching empathy. It was a comfort Alex hadn't realized he craved, a balm he had never received. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not sadness for him, but a quiet recognition of a shared human vulnerability, a deep understanding that bypassed words entirely. For a moment he felt a strange loosening in his chest, a sensation akin to an old, rusted lock slowly giving way. A sliver of long-buried loneliness, a raw, aching need for genuine connection he had dismissed as weakness, began to surface. It was terrifying and disorienting. He had spent his entire adult life building walls, perfecting the art of emotional detachment, convinced that self-sufficiency was the ultimate armor against pain. Yet here, with Clara's unyielding, gentle presence, his carefully constructed fortress felt suddenly permeable. He found himself wanting to speak, to confide, to unravel the intricate tapestry of his guarded past, an urge so foreign and intense it startled him. He cleared his throat, pushing away the unexpected rush of emotion. "It taught me resilience," he managed, his voice a little rougher than intended. He immediately regretted the defensive tone, realizing it was an automatic reflex, a shield deployed against a kindness he wasn't equipped to handle. Clara, still calm, still observant, simply listened. She offered no challenge, no rebuttal. Her quiet acceptance was in itself a profound statement, an invitation to a deeper honesty he was utterly unprepared for. The silence that followed was different now, no longer awkward, but charged with an unspoken understanding, a delicate thread stretching between them across the opulent table. Alex felt a tremor of confusion. This wasn't part of the game. This wasn't about winning a bet or proving a point. This was genuine. A woman he barely knew, a woman he had objectified and dismissed, was somehow seeing past all his carefully cultivated defenses into the very core of his being.
and instead of recoiling or judging, she was offering a quiet, unwavering understanding he hadn't experienced since he was a small child, before the world had taught him that vulnerability was a weakness to be exploited. He was disarmed, unnerved, and deeply, profoundly confused by the unexpected surge of connection he felt towards her, a connection that both terrified and inexplicably drew him closer. The game was no longer merely fraying, it was twisting into something he no longer recognized, something far more perilous and profoundly human than he had ever anticipated. His chest tightened again, not with the superficial irritation he once felt, but with the dizzying, exhilarating, and utterly bewildering pull of an unknown emotion. The unsettling tremor that had seized Alex in Clara's presence lingered for days, a phantom ache beneath his ribs, a persistent question mark hovering in his peripheral vision. He tried to dismiss it, to categorize it as an anomaly, a momentary lapse in his carefully constructed emotional armor, but the quiet understanding he had witnessed in her eyes refused to be forgotten. It chipped away at the cynical edifice he had painstakingly built, revealing an unfamiliar vulnerability he hadn't known he still possessed. Driven by what he convinced himself was merely intellectual curiosity, a desire to fully understand the mechanics of this unforeseen emotional response, he found himself gravitating towards her. He'd catch himself observing her across the vast mansion, watching her interactions with the staff, her serene focus as she read, the way she effortlessly commanded respect without ever raising her voice. He started initiating conversations, not about household matters or social engagements, but about the books she held, the news articles she perused, and the charities she quietly supported. He learned that Clara possessed an insatiable appetite for literature, delving into classics with a profound understanding that surprised him. She spoke of philosophical concepts with an unexpected clarity, her interpretations often shedding new light on ideas he'd only ever considered academically. She wasn't just well-read, she was insightful, connecting disparate concepts with an elegant logic that was both challenging and deeply engaging. Her passion for various charitable initiatives was even more striking. He learned of her quiet dedication to a local women's shelter, her involvement in a literacy program for underprivileged children, and her heartfelt commitment to environmental conservation.
She didn't seek fanfare or publicity. Her work was driven by a deep-seated belief in making a tangible difference. Her stories of the people she helped delivered with genuine empathy and a humble pride that Alex found oddly compelling. Their conversations became an unexpected sanctuary in his otherwise superficial world. Unlike his friends, Clara didn't pander to his ego or seek to impress him with her own wealth or connections. She listened intently, offered considered opinions without judgment, and occasionally challenged his more cynical viewpoints with a gentle but firm logic that forced him to genuinely reflect. He found himself articulating thoughts and feelings he hadn't dared voice to anyone else, not even to himself. And she met them with an unwavering openness that made him feel seen. It was stimulating, yes, intellectually invigorating in a way his business dealings rarely were, but it was also refreshingly honest, a stark contrast to the transactional nature of nearly every other relationship in his life. He began to anticipate their quiet evenings in the library or the conservatory, drawn to the genuine connection that blossomed between them, a connection that had nothing to do with the bet, or his wealth, or any of the external trappings he usually relied on. It was unsettling, this unfamiliar sense of ease, this nascent appreciation for a woman he had so thoroughly underestimated. A few weeks into this evolving dynamic, during a virtual poker night with his usual circle of friends, men whose sharp suits and sharper wit had once defined his world, the conversation inevitably turned to his recent marriage. "Still playing the dutiful husband, Alex?" Julian, always the most cutting, drawled with a smirk, his eyes glinting mischievously from the screen. "Heard you've been seen at some rather quaint charity events. Slumming it with the missus, are we?" Another friend, Mark, chuckled. "Don't tell me Clara's got you reading Tolstoy now, old boy. Next thing you know, you'll be giving up the private jet for a bicycle." The casual cruelty of their remarks,
The thinly veiled disdain for Clara's passions and her unassuming nature ignited an unexpected spark of irritation within Alex. He felt a prickle of something he recognized as defensiveness, a surprising urge to protect her from their flippant cynicism. This wasn't the detached amusement he'd anticipated, nor was it the polite deflection he'd planned. It was a genuine surge of annoyance, a visceral reaction that caught him completely off guard. Clara happens to be a very intelligent and compassionate woman, Alex found himself saying, his voice sharper than he intended, the words surprising even himself. He saw Julian's smirk falter, replaced by a flicker of genuine surprise. And her charity work is far more meaningful than anything any of us do in our privileged little bubbles. Mark raised an eyebrow, a hint of genuine confusion replacing his mirth. Whoa, Alex, easy there. Just a bit of banter. Getting a little protective of the unconventional wife, are we? The jab was meant to be light, but it landed with an unfamiliar weight, confirming Alex's unexpected emotional response. He felt a flush creep up his neck, not from embarrassment, but from a strange cocktail of defiance and a growing, potent anger at his friend's superficiality. He found himself defending her, not because it was part of the bet or because he needed to maintain appearances, but because he genuinely felt she deserved it. He was defending Clara, the woman he had married as a mere pawn in a game, and the realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The game, his carefully constructed game, was not just fraying at the edges anymore. It was actively crumbling around him, replaced by something real, something he hadn't bargained for, something profoundly unsettling and undeniably, terrifyingly human. The unknown emotion was no longer just a pull, it was a demand. An insistence, twisting his world into a shape he no longer recognized, and he found himself both bewildered and undeniably drawn deeper into its uncharted territory. The unsettling, powerful anger Alex felt defending Clara lingered, an unfamiliar heat in his veins that both bewildered and solidified his resolve. The game, once a source of cynical amusement, now felt like a suffocating shroud, and the woman he had chosen as a pawn was fast becoming the most potent, disarming force in his carefully constructed life. He found himself, almost unconsciously, gravitating towards her presence, seeking out the quiet calm she exuded, a stark contrast to the cacophony of his own thoughts. Their evenings, once spent in separate wings of the sprawling mansion, gradually began to merge. It started subtly, with Alex passing by the library to find Clara engrossed in a worn, leather-bound volume, a soft lamp casting a warm glow on her serene face. He'd pause, initially offering a perfunctory goodnight, but soon curiosity would pull him in. He'd ask about her book, feigning casual interest, only to find himself drawn into surprisingly rich discussions. Clara's knowledge was vast, her insights keen, often revealing layers in the text, or indeed in life, that Alex, despite his supposedly superior intellect, had never considered. He'd find himself pulling up an armchair, not reading his own financial reports as was his habit, but listening, truly listening, as she spoke of philosophers or poets with a quiet passion that was utterly captivating. There was no pretense in her, no agenda, just an honest engagement with the world. And Alex, for the first time in years, felt the satisfying itch of intellectual stimulation that wasn't tied to profit or power. He found himself offering his own perspectives, surprisingly candid ones, and watched as Clara absorbed them, her gaze steady and non-judgmental, making him feel understood in a way he hadn't experienced since childhood, if even then. One evening, he made a flippant remark about the quaintness of a certain classic, a casual attempt to assert his usual cynical detachment, but Clara merely looked at him, her eyes holding a deep, knowing light. Quaintness, Alex, she mused softly, is often merely another word for enduring truth, for things that defy the ephemeral trends you seem to chase so fervently. Her words, delivered without malice or accusation, struck him with the force of a revelation. She saw through his carefully constructed shields, not by trying to dismantle them,
but by simply existing in a space where they held no power. He felt exposed yet not vulnerable, understood rather than judged. It was unsettling, this effortless ability she had to pierce his facades, but beneath the discomfort, a strange, profound sense of peace began to root, a feeling of being accepted for the man beneath the millionaire, the man he barely knew himself. The deepening of their connection took an even more significant turn when Clara spoke of an upcoming charity gala she was organizing, not for socialite showmanship, but to raise funds for a literacy program she passionately supported. Alex, initially dismissive, found himself agreeing to attend, a decision driven by a complex mix of guilt over the bet and a growing desire to see Clara in her element. The evening was a revelation. It wasn't the glitzy, performative philanthropy he was accustomed to. It was genuine, earnest, and filled with people whose dedication shone through. Clara, far from being overwhelmed, moved through the room with an innate grace and quiet authority. Her genuine warmth drew people to her. Alex watched her speak with a young woman whose life had been transformed by the literacy program, her eyes alight with empathy, her voice filled with encouragement. He saw the tangible impact of her work, the real good she brought into the world, and felt a profound sense of shame for ever having viewed her, or anything truly meaningful, through the lens of transactional value. He even found himself engaging with some of the attendees, speaking not of business but of shared human stories, of the power of education. And in those moments the weight of his usual self-importance seemed to lift. He caught himself smiling, genuinely smiling, as Clara recounted a humorous anecdote about a book donation, and the fleeting joy was quickly followed by a sharp pang of internal conflict. This unfamiliar sense of peace and acceptance, this strange burgeoning admiration for Clara was both profoundly pleasant and utterly unsettling. It chipped away at the foundations of his identity, threatening to expose the hollow man he had been, the man who had made a bet that now felt like a monstrous betrayal. Every shared laugh, every insightful conversation, every moment of quiet understanding deepened the chasm between the Alex who had orchestrated the bet and the Alex who was now being undeniably, terrifyingly transformed. The uncharted territory he had stepped into was vast, beautiful, and fraught with an emotional complexity he had never anticipated, a complexity that held him captive, even as it promised to shatter everything he thought he knew. The comfortable rhythm of their shared life had solidified, weaving itself into the very fabric of Alex's days in a way he hadn't thought possible. He found himself anticipating Clara's presence, her quiet insights, her gentle laughter that seemed to ripple through the mansion's vast halls like a forgotten melody. He began to notice the small, intimate details, the way her brow furrowed slightly when she was lost in thought, the subtle shift in her posture when she was truly engaged in a conversation, the particular light that danced in her eyes when she spoke of her charity work. These observations were no longer mere curiosities. They were moments that tugged at something deep within him, igniting a warmth that spread through his chest, settling into a feeling he couldn't or wouldn't yet name. It was an involuntary lean into her space, a lingering gaze that held more than just interest, a quiet protectiveness that rose unbidden whenever she faced even the slightest inconvenience. The undeniable truth began to crystallize within Alex. He wasn't just charmed, not just intrigued, but genuinely, profoundly drawn to Clara. Affection had blossomed into something more potent, more consuming, a burgeoning love that had stealthily infiltrated the fortified walls of his cynicism. He found himself thinking of her in moments of solitude, a strange emptiness echoing when she wasn't near, a fierce pride swelling when she effortlessly navigated a complex social situation, her grace and integrity shining brighter than any diamond. This wasn't the transactional satisfaction he had expected. This was an emotional landscape he had never known existed, a verdant and beautiful terrain that both exhilarated and terrified him. But with this burgeoning love came a crushing, suffocating weight, the ghost of the original bet. Every moment of shared laughter, every tender glance, every burgeoning sentiment of genuine care became a fresh stab of guilt, a monstrous betrayal that gnawed at his conscience. The memory of his arrogant wager, the callousness with which he had viewed Clara as a mere pawn in his elaborate game,
now felt like a leaden cloak pressing down on him, threatening to suffocate the fragile new feelings he cherished. He would catch himself in a moment of pure, unadulterated happiness with Clara, only for the cold dread to seep in, reminding him of the ticking clock, the impending doom of a revelation that could shatter everything. The internal conflict was a relentless battle, a war between the man he was desperately trying to become and the cruel, cynical architect of his past, a past that now felt like an alien nightmare. The contrast between his life with Clara and his old circle of friends became stark, almost unbearable. When his phone rang, displaying the familiar names of Julian or Marcus, a wave of revulsion would wash over him. Their casual banter, once the comforting backdrop of his world, now sounded hollow, their ambitions superficial, their entire existence predicated on a ruthless pursuit of transient pleasures and public validation. He found himself actively avoiding their calls, declining their invitations to lavish parties and high-stakes poker games, their carefully constructed facades now transparent, revealing nothing but emptiness. A recent lunch with Julian, ostensibly to catch up, had been an excruciating ordeal. Julian's crude jokes about his unconventional wife and his self-congratulatory anecdotes about his latest conquest left Alex feeling physically ill. He saw the shallowness reflected in Julian's eyes, the same shallowness he once proudly wore, and a surge of profound disgust, not just for his friend, but for the man he had been, twisted his gut. He despised the cynical, calculating Alex who had made that bet, the man who believed love was a weakness, a transaction, a farce. The thought of that past self filled him with a bitter shame that was almost unbearable. How could he have been so blind, so cruel, so utterly misguided? The Alex who now spent quiet evenings reading beside Clara or discussed the intricacies of social justice with her was a stranger to that old identity, and the chasm between the two was growing wider with each passing day. He was a man caught between two worlds, the opulent cage of his past and the terrifying, beautiful freedom Clara offered, a freedom that came with the ultimate price of facing his own monstrous deception. The deeper his feelings for Clara grew, the more desperately he clung to the burgeoning hope of a future with her, and the more terrifyingly imminent the threat of the bet's exposure became, a secret poised to explode and obliterate every fragile tendril of happiness he had found. Alex moved through Julian's opulent party like a ghost, Clara a quiet anchor beside him. The lavish setting, once his domain, now felt like a gilded cage. Every laugh, every clink of glasses amplified the dread drumming in his chest. He was keenly aware of his friends' knowing glances, their contemptuous whispers when they looked at Clara. To them, she was a curiosity, a temporary aberration, a punchline. To him, she was his world, and the dissonance was a constant low thrum of terror. He instinctively sought her hand, a silent shield against the truth lurking beneath his polished life. Julian, Alex's oldest and most cunning friend, detached himself from a group of models, a predatory glint in his eyes. His smile was too wide, too sharp. Alex, darling, still playing house, and Clara, my dear, looking radiant as ever, he purred, his sneer barely disguised as his gaze lingered on Clara. Alex tensed, bracing for a veiled insult, but what came next was far more insidious. Julian leaned in, his voice dripping with false concern, loud enough to carry. You know, Clara, Alex has always been quite the gambler. Remember that wager, Alex? A year with our lovely Clara for, a cool 10 million, wasn't it? The words hung in the air, a poisonous vapor. Clara's breath caught, a tiny gasp. Her gentle smile crumbled, her warm eyes turned icy, then wide, with dawning horror. It was a physical blow, stealing the color from her face, leaving her utterly pale. The party noise faded, the glittering lights blurred. She turned slowly to Alex, her hand, unknowingly still clutched in his, now trembling. Her gaze was not yet accusation, but profound, bewildered devastation. A cold dread seeped into her bones. This couldn't be real. This couldn't explain everything she hadn't understood. Alex felt the world tilt. Julian's cruel words pierced Clara's heart and skewered his own wound, tearing open the festering wound of his deceit. He lunged, grabbing Julian's arm, his voice a low, furious growl. "Julian, you despicable bastard! Get out!" But the damage was done. Clara was already pulling away, her eyes fixed on him with disbelief and utter heartbreak. He watched the trust vanish. He stammered, his mind racing for words, but none came. His tongue felt thick, his facade shattering. Exposed, naked in his monstrous hypocrisy, he felt the cold judgment of his past. Clara didn't wait for an explanation. With a quiet dignity that belied the earthquake inside her, she walked away, each step a testament to a strength Alex was only beginning to understand. He watched her go, a gaping wound in his chest, knowing a piece of his soul was being dragged away. His legs felt heavy, weighed by guilt. He caught her in a secluded hallway, her back to him, shoulder shake.
"Clara, please," he choked, his voice raw. She turned, face streaked with tears, eyes blazing with pain. "Is it true, Alex?" she whispered, barely audible, sharp as ice. "Was it all a bet?" The question hung, suffocating. Alex's mouth opened, but no words formed. How could he explain his heart's labyrinthian journey, his seismic shift, when their foundation was such a grotesque lie? Shame, burning and potent, rendered him mute. He saw his past self in her heartbroken eyes and recoiled. He longed to tell her of quiet evenings, shared laughter, the profound peace she brought, how she chipped away his cynicism. He wanted to tell her the bet had died 1,000 deaths, replaced by consuming love. But only a desperate, guttural sound emerged, a choked plea of misery and terrifying loss. He extended a hand tentatively, but she flinched. The distance felt insurmountable, carved by his unforgivable sin. Silence stretched, heavy with accusations and paralyzing guilt. Alex finally found his voice, a raw, ragged sound that barely resembled his own. It started as a bet, Clara," he rasped, each word a splinter tearing at his throat. "A cruel, idiotic bet with my friends who are no longer my friends. A bet to marry someone unconventional, to prove some cynical point about love, about life. I thought it was a game, a transaction. I thought I could control it, control my emotions, control everything." He swallowed hard, the taste of ash in his mouth. "I chose you because you were everything I wasn't looking for. I thought you'd be easy to dismiss, easy to forget." He looked up, meeting her tear-filled eyes, and saw not just pain but a dawning horror. "God, Clara, I was a monster. An arrogant, self-serving fool. I believed love was a weakness, a calculation. I believed money could buy anything. Even a year of a person's life." His shoulders slumped, the weight of his confession crushing him. I never meant for it to hurt you. I never meant for any of this to be real, not like this." His voice cracked, desperate. "But it is real, Clara. My feelings for you, they are the only real thing I've ever known." Clara listened, her breath catching in her throat with each brutal revelation. Her initial heartbreak solidified into a cold, trembling fury. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, nails digging into her palms. The man standing before her, stripped of his usual composed facade, confessing his abhorrent origins, was both a stranger and the man she had come to care for, to respect, to feel something akin to tenderness for. But tenderness for a lie? The irony was a bitter bile rising in her throat. "A bet," she repeated, her voice a low, dangerous whisper that cut through the silence like a shard of glass. "You reduced me to a pawn in your cruel little game, a spectacle,
an unconventional woman for your amusement. Her eyes, once soft, now blazed with an inferno of betrayal. Do you know what that feels like, Alex? To know that every kind word, every shared laughter, every moment of supposed connection was built on a foundation of such grotesque deceit? To realize the man I thought was slowly emerging from behind a wall of cynicism was nothing but a character in your elaborate performance. She shook her head, a single, furious tear escaping and carving a path down her cheek. I saw something good in you, Alex. I saw vulnerability, kindness, a spark of genuine humanity. I believed in that man. Her voice rose, thick with anguish. But that man was a ghost, a phantom of my own making, projected onto a cruel, calculating stranger. He reached for her again, a silent plea in his outstretched hand. Clara, please, I changed. You changed me. The bet died months ago. It doesn't matter anymore, not to me. All that matters is you. But she recoiled as if burned, her gaze turning arctic. It matters to me, she spat, the word laced with venom. It matters that the very beginning, the very core of our being together was a transaction, a mockery. How can I ever trust a single word you say, a single gesture you make, knowing that? She took a shaky step back, then another, the grand, opulent room suddenly feeling suffocatingly small. I can't. I simply can't. The man who made that bet, he's still a part of you. And the man I thought I loved was just an illusion. Her decision, though tearing her apart, was clear, unyielding. I need to leave, Alex. The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. Leave. The thought alone was an unbearable agony. No, Clara, don't, please. I'll do anything. I'll tell everyone. I'll make it right. Just don't leave. He stumbled forward, but she was already turning, moving with a decisive grace he hadn't thought he capable of in his distress. There's no making it right for this, Alex. Not now. Not when everything I believed about us has been shattered into a million pieces. She walked towards the door, her back ramrod straight, leaving him standing amongst the ruins of his carefully constructed life. He watched her go, a gaping void opening in his chest. The click of the door closing echoed like a gunshot, sealing his fate. The silence that followed was not heavy with accusation anymore, but with an absolute, deafening emptiness. Alex sank to his knees, the polished marble floor cold beneath him, mirroring the desolation in his soul. The mansion, once a symbol of his power and achievement, now felt like a gilded cage, vast and desolate. The true cost of his cynicism, of his cold-hearted games, crashed down upon him with brutal finality.
He had gambled with a human heart, with genuine affection, and in doing so, he had lost everything that truly mattered. The money, the status, the approval of his superficial friends, all of it now felt like dust, ashes, compared to the vibrant, life-giving presence that had just walked out of his life. He had loved her. Truly loved her, a love so profound it had reshaped his entire being, peeling back layers of hardened indifference he hadn't even realized he possessed. And he had destroyed it, with his own hand, with a past sin that now seemed unforgivable. He had chased after a shallow victory, only to discover, too late, that the real prize was the woman he had driven away. A profound despair settled over him, a crushing weight that promised no easy escape. The realization was a bitter, searing brand. His love for Clara was absolute, and his loss was utterly deserved. He was left alone, in the cold, cavernous space, with nothing but the echoes of her pain and the suffocating burden of his own irreversible regret. The game was over, and Alex, for the first time in his life, knew what it meant to truly lose. The future stretched before him, an endless, terrifying expanse without her. He couldn't breathe. The mansion, once his fortress, now echoed Clara's absence, each silence a fresh wound. Despair, however, ignited a fierce resolve. He would not lose her. His first act was immediate, brutal. He called an unscheduled press conference, not for PR, but for self-immolation. With raw honesty that shocked the media and destroyed his public persona, Alex denounced the bet, his friends, and his shallow world, accepting full responsibility. He spoke not of donations, but of a profound moral reckoning, vowing to dedicate his resources and being to genuine philanthropy, highlighting the underserved communities Clara championed. His voice trembled, his haunted eyes conveying a truth rarely seen, an admission of utter brokenness. Clara, secluded in a quiet apartment, saw broadcast snippets. Each clip was a fresh stab, yet beneath the pain, a tremor stirred. The man on screen wasn't the aloof Alex she knew. He was raw, exposed. Her initial reaction was cynical, another manipulation. Yet his actions were harder to dismiss. Reports flooded in. Alex had severed all ties with his old circle, facing their ridicule with serene indifference. More importantly, his name appeared not in gossip, but connected with causes she held dear. Literacy programs, women's shelters, environmental cleanups. He wasn't just writing checks, he was physically present, sleeves rolled up, engaging. He sent no grand gestures, only quiet, handwritten letters filled with painful apologies and project updates, always ending with, "I understand if you never reply, but I had to tell you." Each letter sat, unread for days. Then curiosity, or an old tenderness, compelled her to open it. She recognized sincerity in his clumsy words, desperate hope in his humility. She saw photographs. Alex, older, more tired, but with a different light in his eyes, talking intently with volunteers at a soup kitchen, reading to children at a library she'd helped fund. The man who had played her was, inexplicably, becoming the man she had secretly hoped he could be. Her heart, a fortress of hurt, began to crack. Anger still burned, but a tiny, imperceptible warmth seeped through, a dangerous, fragile hope for a future she thought lost. The path ahead was treacherous, yet for the first time since leaving, Clara paused, listening to the echoes of his changed world and wondering. The echoes of Alex's transformed world resonated deeply within Clara, stirring a painful melody of regret and nascent hope. Her anger, once a fiery shield, had slowly cooled, revealing a fragile landscape beneath. She reread his clumsy apologies, studied the faded photographs of a man she barely recognized, but whose earnestness was undeniable. The Alex she had married was a callous, calculating stranger. The Alex depicted in his letters, quietly building a new life dedicated to others, was the man her heart had secretly yearned for. Her decision was not a sudden burst of forgiveness, but a slow, arduous climb from the depths of betrayal. One rainy afternoon, instead of burning his latest letter, she penned a short reply. "I'll be at the old bookshop, Tuesday." The air crackled with unspoken tension when they met, the weight of their past a palpable presence. Alex, stripped of his usual composure, looked vulnerable, his eyes pleading for a second chance. Clara, observing the man who had humbled himself so completely, felt her remaining defenses crumble. It wasn't just forgiveness for the bet, but for the cynical man he'd been, an acceptance of the man he'd fought so hard to become. His love, no longer a calculated game, shone with an authentic, enduring light. Months later, under a canopy of stars in their now shared garden, they renewed their vows. There were no flashing cameras, no press releases. Only Clara and a simple white dress, and Alex, his hand trembling as he slipped a new ring onto her finger, whispering promises of honesty, respect, and an unbreakable love forged in the fires of their shared ordeal. Their bond, once a painful deception,
had transformed into a powerful testament to redemption and the profound healing power of connection. Together, they built a future filled with purpose, joy, and a quiet, profound understanding, their past now a distant, educational shadow. Thank you for joining us on this extraordinary journey of love, betrayal, and transformation. If this story moved your heart, please tap that like button, subscribe for more captivating tales, and share your thoughts in the comments below.